At 8:12 a.m., my CEO smiled the way people do when they think they're holding the last card and said my position was no longer needed. By 8:14, the color drained from our CFO's face as a single name surfaced from a document buried so deep it was supposed to stay invisible forever. What happened in those 2 minutes changed the merger and revealed who was truly expendable. Ruby Chen had always believed that offices had their own weather, not the kind listed in forecasts, but the invisible climate that settled over glass conference rooms and polished concrete floors. Some mornings felt like spring, light, harmless, buzzing with possibility. Others carried the metallic taste of a coming storm. That Tuesday morning tasted like lightning. At 7:43 a.m., Ruby stepped out of the elevator onto the 32nd floor of Ariane Systems, balancing a paper cup of coffee and her laptop bag against her shoulder. The reception area gleamed as if someone had polished every surface before dawn. The company logo floated on the wall in brushed steel, all sharp edges and ambition. Outside, the city was waking beneath a veil of silver mist. Inside, people were smiling too hard. That was her first clue. The legal team moved in pairs, speaking in whispers that snapped shut when anyone passed. HR wore expressions of theatrical serenity, the kind flight attendants use when turbulence begins. And on every monitor in every conference room, the same slide glowed like a promise. Project Atlas, closing day. The $300 million merger. The deal the CEO, Martin Hale, had compared to putting a rocket under this company. Ruby had built most of the engine. She wasn't a vice president. She didn't have an executive parking space or a title inflated by buzzwords. Her official role was Senior Infrastructure Security Manager. Unofficially, she was the person who knew where the digital skeletons were buried. If the company were a cathedral, Martin gave the sermons, the CFO counted the donations, and Ruby made sure the roof didn't collapse on everyone. She swiped into the server room to complete her usual checks. The cool air wrapped around her like an old friend. Servers blinked in orderly rows, tiny green lights pulsing like patient heartbeats. Machines were honest. People were not. Her phone vibrated. 8:03 a.m. Martin Hale. Need you in boardroom A at 8:10. Quick sync. Ruby stared at the message. Quick sync. Two words that had ruined more mornings than bad coffee. Still, she felt no panic. If anything, she expected a last-minute technical question about access controls or regulatory disclosures. Project Atlas had consumed her life for 9 months. She had slept under her desk twice and once missed her sister's birthday because the data room needed to be re-encrypted before midnight. No one had thanked her. That was normal. What was unusual was the way the CFO, Daniel Mercer, looked at her when she crossed the hallway. Daniel was a man who usually resembled a marble bust. Perfect posture, no visible pulse. But now his hand tightened around a folder, and his eyes slid away too quickly, as if he'd seen a ghost. Ruby gave him a small nod. He didn't return it. That was her second clue. Boardroom A sat at the end of the corridor like a jewel box. Frosted glass walls, walnut table, chairs so expensive they looked uncomfortable on principle. Martin stood at the far end of the room. Tall, silver-haired, immaculately composed. He had the sort of confidence that seemed custom-tailored along with his suit. Beside him sat Helen from HR, hands folded on a leather notebook. Ruby stopped just inside the door. "Should I be worried?" she asked lightly. Martin smiled. It was the smile of a man unveiling a sculpture he expected everyone to admire. "Ruby, have a seat." She remained standing. Helen cleared her throat. "This won't take long." That phrase, Ruby thought, was corporate for "you won't enjoy this." Martin steepled his fingers. "As you know, after the merger, there will be some restructuring." "Of course." He nodded, wearing sympathy like an expensive tie. "Your role is no longer needed." There it was. 8 simple words, cold and precise as a scalpel. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. Ruby had anticipated many things this morning. System alerts, investor demands, legal questions. Termination had not made the list. She set her coffee on the table with deliberate care. "Today?" she asked. Martin exhaled as if burdened by his own generosity. Effective immediately. Helen slid an envelope toward her. The white paper looked absurdly small. Ruby didn't touch it. Outside the glass wall, employees moved through the hallway carrying laptops and pastries, unaware that a career was being folded away like yesterday's memo. Ruby met Martin's eyes. 5 minutes before closing. It's simply timing. Timing, she repeated softly, letting the word hang between them like smoke. Martin leaned back. You've done excellent work, but the acquiring company has its own team. Ruby almost laughed. Excellent work. Like complimenting the architect while bulldozing the building. She should have felt anger first. Instead, she felt something quieter. A click. The kind of sound a lock makes when the tumblers align. Because Martin had made one fatal assumption. He thought the person who built the vault had no idea what was inside it. Helen continued speaking about severance, benefits, and return of company property. Ruby heard almost none of it. In her mind, a timeline assembled itself with crystalline clarity. 8:12, terminated. 8:17, merger close. 8:20, celebratory champagne. Martin was already picturing his interview quotes. What he didn't know was that 2 weeks earlier, during a routine audit, Ruby had found a service account hidden behind an innocuous name, Orion Legacy Admin. The account had unrestricted access to financial repositories. It was created 7 years ago. Its owner field contained one name, Elias Voss. The problem was simple. Elias Voss did not officially exist anywhere in the company's records. No employment file, no contractor agreement, no board minutes. Nothing. A ghost with root access. Ruby had flagged it to Daniel Mercer. He had gone unusually pale and asked her, in a voice too casual to be casual, to leave that one alone. She hadn't. Instead, she documented everything and stored the findings in a password-protected PDF. Insurance, she called it. Not because she planned to use it. Because experience had taught her that if someone tells you not to open a locked door, there is usually a reason they're afraid of what's behind it. Helen stopped speaking. Martin folded his hands. Do you have any questions? Ruby looked at him for a long second. Rain began to tap against the windows, soft and steady. The city outside blurred into watercolor gray. Yes, she said. Martin raised an eyebrow. Ruby offered a calm, almost friendly smile. Who decided my role was no longer needed? Martin's expression tightened by a fraction. The executive team. I see. She picked up the envelope. No trembling hands. No dramatic exit. Just quiet composure. The kind that makes people underestimate you. And underestimation, Ruby had learned, was the most useful disguise in the world. As she reached the door, Martin added, Please hand in your access immediately. Ruby turned. Of course. The door clicked shut behind her. The hallway suddenly felt sharper, every sound amplified. Keyboards clattering, phones buzzing, heels striking polished stone. Ruby walked to her desk. No one looked up. Her fingers moved with surgical precision. Laptop open. Security console. Credentials revoked. SSH keys disabled. Session tokens terminated, exactly as requested. Then she opened the encrypted folder on her personal device. The PDF sat there like a sealed letter addressed to fate. She attached it to a single email. Recipient, the lead banker overseeing the merger. Subject line, material undisclosed access risk. She hovered over send. For a heartbeat, she saw Martin's confident smile, Daniel's frightened eyes, the invisible name. Ruby clicked. Send. The email vanished. So did the illusion that this morning belonged to someone else. At 8:14, through the glass walls of the executive conference room, Ruby saw Daniel Mercer open his phone. She watched the blood drain from his face so quickly it was almost artistic. And for the first time that morning, she allowed herself a small smile. The storm had finally reached the penthouse. Some secrets cost careers. Others cost $300 million. And Ruby had a feeling this was only the beginning. If you think the next 2 minutes were tense, wait until you see who tried to stop Ruby before the bankers opened to page 3. At 8:15 a.m., the 32nd floor changed its rhythm. It was subtle at first, the same way you notice a song has shifted to a minor key, before you understand why your chest suddenly feels tight. Assistant stopped mid-stride. The receptionist lowered her voice. Someone from legal hurried past Ruby carrying a stack of binders pressed to his chest like a shield. And behind the frosted glass of boardroom A, silhouettes that had been relaxed and celebratory just moments earlier became rigid. Ruby slipped her laptop into her bag with the unhurried precision of a surgeon setting down her instruments. There was no dramatic flourish, no triumphant soundtrack, just the soft zip of a bag and the distant hum of the HVAC. Quiet sounds, dangerous sounds. Her phone buzzed. Daniel Mercer, incoming call. Ruby looked at the screen for 2 rings before answering. Ruby. Daniel's voice had lost its polished investor cadence. It sounded thinner, stretched like paper held too close to a flame. What exactly did you send? She stepped toward the windows. Rain traced silver lines across the glass, turning the city into a blurred watercolor of steel and light. Documentation, she said. To whom? The bank. There was a pause. Not silence, something heavier. The kind of pause in which a person recalculates their future. Why would you do that? Ruby let herself smile. Because 5 minutes ago, you all decided my judgment was no longer required. Daniel exhaled sharply. Ruby, listen to me carefully. You need to recall that email. You know as well as I do that I can't. His voice dropped to a whisper. You have no idea what this could trigger. That, she thought, was the first honest sentence anyone had spoken to her all morning. I think I have a pretty good idea. She ended the call. 2 seconds later, Martin Hale appeared at the far end of the corridor. For the first time in the 6 years Ruby had worked under him, the CEO did not look composed. He moved quickly, his expression tight, one hand gripping his phone. Executives usually floated through the office like cruise ships, smooth, untouchable, expensive. Martin was moving like a man who had just spotted an iceberg. Ruby! His voice carried just enough force to turn heads. Several employees looked up, then looked down just as quickly, pretending sudden fascination with spreadsheets. Ruby waited. Martin stopped in front of her, lowering his voice. What did you send? Interesting, Ruby thought. Not, did you send something he already knew? A due diligence concern. Martin's jaw tightened. You were instructed to report internal issues through proper channels. I did. The words landed like pebbles dropped into deep water. His eyes flashed. This merger affects hundreds of employees. And hidden administrator accounts with no legal identity affect investors. For a moment, neither of them moved. The rain intensified against the windows. Martin glanced toward boardroom A, where legal counsel and bankers were now filing in at an unnatural pace. Do you understand what you're risking? Ruby tilted her head. My job? The irony hung between them like static. Martin stepped closer, lowering his voice to a velvet threat. Think very carefully about your next move. Ruby met his gaze. I did. That's why I documented everything. Something flickered in his expression. Not anger, fear. Tiny, brief, but unmistakable. And that frightened Ruby more than any shouting would have. Because if Martin Hale was scared, the truth was larger than she'd imagined. He straightened his tie with a practiced motion, as if adjusting fabric could restore control. We can still resolve this internally. Ruby almost admired the phrasing. When executives said internally, they usually meant quietly. And when they said resolve, they often meant erase. Then you should have listened when I raised it. Martin stared at her for one long second, then turned and walked back toward the boardroom. Not rushed, not running, but carrying the unmistakable stiffness of a man trying not to let anyone see him bleed. Ruby's laptop chimed. New email from Hannah Roth, Vice President, M&A Advisory. Her pulse quickened. She opened the message. Ruby, thank you for flagging this. We are pausing. Closing pending immediate clarification. Please make yourself available for a confidential call at 8:45. One sentence and the entire morning tilted. The merger was on hold. $300 million suspended in midair because of a name that wasn't supposed to exist. Elias Voss, the ghost in the machine. Ruby closed her eyes for a moment. She felt no gloating, only a strange and steady sense of balance, like watching a crooked painting finally hang straight. Her desk phone rang, then her mobile, then a message from Helen in HR. Please remain on site until further notice. Ruby laughed softly. 20 minutes ago, they wanted her gone immediately. Now they wanted her available. Corporate loyalty, she thought, had the lifespan of a soap bubble. Across the office, whispers spread in widening circles. No one knew exactly what had happened, but offices have their own nervous system. Information traveled through glances, posture, and the speed at which assistants refilled coffee. The celebration catering team arrived anyway. A young man in a white jacket wheeled in silver trays and chilled champagne. He paused when he saw the atmosphere. The scene reminded Ruby of a wedding where someone had just objected. She gathered her notebook. Inside were dates, screenshots, audit logs, and one handwritten line she had circled weeks ago. Who authorized Elias Voss? That question was no longer hers alone. At 8:31, Daniel Mercer emerged from boardroom A. He looked 10 years older. His tie was loosened. His eyes found Ruby across the room. For a moment, his face held something unexpected. Not hostility, regret. He walked toward her slowly. Ruby. She waited. He lowered his voice. There are things you don't understand. Then this is your chance to explain. Daniel looked around to ensure no one was within earshot. When he spoke, his words were barely audible. Elias Voss was never an employee. Ruby felt the floor shift beneath her. Then who was he? Daniel swallowed. His expression tightened as though even speaking the truth had a cost. He was a condition. Before Ruby could ask what that meant, Helen from HR hurried over. Daniel, they need you back inside. He stepped away, but not before murmuring one final sentence. If they ask, tell them you found the account during a routine audit. Nothing more. Then he disappeared behind the glass doors. Ruby stood motionless. A condition. Not a person. Not an employee. A condition. The phrase coiled in her mind like smoke. Her phone vibrated again. Unknown number. She answered. A calm male voice said, Ms. Chen, this is outside counsel for the acquiring company. Before we begin, there is one question we need answered immediately. Ruby looked toward the boardroom where the fate of careers, reputations, and a $300 million merger now hung by a thread. Yes? The lawyer spoke carefully. Who else knows the name Elias Voss? And in that moment, Ruby realized the most dangerous part of the morning wasn't that she had exposed a secret. It was that some secrets were designed to survive exposure. And someone was about to learn she wasn't the only person who had been keeping records. If you think Martin looked worried, wait until you hear what Ruby found in the signature history. If you were in Ruby's position, would you have hit send? Let me know in the comments and subscribe to see what was hidden behind the name Elias Voss. At 8:45 a.m., Ruby stepped into the smallest conference room on the floor. It was called Cedar, though there was nothing remotely Cedar-like about it. The room smelled faintly of printer toner and ambition. Frosted glass walls blurred the figures outside into moving shadows, as if the office itself were trying to eavesdrop without being seen. Ruby closed the door and set her notebook on the table. Her reflection in the dark monitor looked calm. She didn't feel calm. She felt like a violin string pulled one turn too tight. Her phone buzzed again. Hannah Roth, M&A Advisory. Ruby answered. Ms. Chen, thank you for making yourself available. Hannah's voice was crisp and controlled, the verbal equivalent of a legal signature. Of course. We've reviewed the document you sent. A pause. The kind that stretches long enough for your imagination to sprint ahead. Can you confirm the account labeled Orion Legacy Admin had unrestricted access to financial repositories? Yes. And the owner field listed Elias Voss? Yes. Another pause. Then Hannah said something that made Ruby sit straighter. We've cross-checked the name against all diligence materials. There is no disclosure of any such individual, trust, or related entity. Ruby's fingers tightened around her pen. Then Daniel Mercer was telling the truth. I beg your pardon? He said Elias Voss wasn't an employee. Silence, not uncertainty, calculation. When Hannah spoke again, her tone had changed. Ms. Chen, did Mr. Mercer provide any additional explanation? Ruby glanced at the frosted glass. Outside, blurred silhouettes moved quickly between conference rooms, carrying folders like firefighters carrying hoses toward smoke. He said Elias Voss was a condition. The line went still. Ruby could hear the faint rustle of papers on Hannah's end. When Hannah returned, her voice had lost a degree of professional neutrality. Please do not discuss this with anyone else. That sentence, more than any other, told Ruby she had stepped onto something much larger than a technical anomaly. I understand. We may need your audit logs, your notes, and a formal statement. You'll have them. Thank you, Ms. Chen. The call ended. Ruby stared at the dark screen. Condition. The word lingered like perfume in an empty room. Not a person, not a consultant. A condition. What kind of deal came with a hidden condition buried inside a server account? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock. Before she could answer, Daniel Mercer stepped inside and closed the door behind him. For the first time, the CFO looked unmistakably human. His shoulders sagged. His eyes were rimmed with exhaustion. Without the immaculate posture and polished tone, he looked like a man who had spent years carrying a weight he was never allowed to set down. I have 3 minutes, he said. Ruby folded her arms. Then use them well. Daniel gave a humorless smile. That sounds like you. Rain drummed against the windows, soft but relentless. He sat across from her, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles blanched. 7 years ago, he began, Orion Systems was close to bankruptcy. Ruby said nothing. She remembered the company's official story: strategic restructuring, bold leadership, a visionary turnaround. Corporate biographies were like polished marble statues, beautiful, impressive, and carved to hide the cracks. Daniel exhaled slowly. Banks wouldn't touch us. Investors were gone. Payroll was 2 weeks from failing. Then what happened? He looked directly at her. A private transfer arrived overnight. How much? Enough to keep the company alive. Ruby felt a chill. From whom? Daniel's eyes drifted to the frosted glass as if the walls themselves might be listening. No one ever told me. You signed the books. Yes. Then you know. He hesitated. And in that hesitation, Ruby understood that knowledge and proof were not always the same thing. Daniel lowered his voice. The funds came through a legal structure with one requirement. Ruby's heartbeat quickened, which was that an account remain active, unrestricted, untouched, auditable by exactly one name. Ruby barely whispered the question. Elias Voss? Daniel nodded. The name landed between them with the weight of a sealed vault door. Who was he? Daniel's expression tightened. I don't know. Ruby stared at him. You expect me to believe the CFO kept a ghost account alive for 7 years without knowing who controlled it? Daniel looked tired enough to tell the truth. I believed the alternative was losing the company. His words hung in the air. For the first time, Ruby felt something unexpected. Not sympathy, but understanding. Fear had a remarkable talent for dressing itself as practicality. Daniel rubbed his temples. Martin inherited the arrangement when he became CEO. So he knew. Yes. Did the board? Daniel's silence answered for him. Ruby leaned back. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, low and ominous. The office seemed to shrink around them. One hidden account, she said quietly, with unrestricted access to financial systems. Daniel nodded. One invisible name. Another nod. And you thought no one would notice? We hoped no one would look. The honesty of that sentence struck Ruby harder than any denial could have. In the world of executives, the most dangerous strategy was often not deception. It was dependence on everyone else being too busy to ask questions. Daniel stood. I'm telling you this because if the acquiring company reports this to regulators, Martin will try to frame you as a disgruntled employee. Ruby let out a soft laugh. He fired the wrong person for that. For the first time all morning, Daniel almost smiled. Yes, he said. He did. He moved to the door, then paused. There's one more thing. Ruby looked up. Daniel's face had gone pale again. The signature history on that account. What about it? It was accessed last night. Ruby felt every muscle tighten. By whom? Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper. The credentials were authenticated from Martin Hale's office. The words hit like cold water. The CEO hadn't merely known about the account. He had used it. Last night. Hours before firing the only person who had documented it. Daniel opened the door. Before leaving, he turned back. If Martin asks, I was never here. Then he disappeared into the corridor. Ruby sat motionless. The rain outside had become a steady silver curtain, obscuring the skyline. In the reflection on the glass, her own eyes looked sharper than she remembered. Martin Hale had not fired her because her role was no longer needed. He had fired her because she had looked under the floorboards and found footprints. And those footprints were fresh. Her laptop chimed. A new email from Hannah Roth. Subject, immediate request. Ruby opened it. One sentence. Ms. Chen, the acquiring company has suspended the merger indefinitely pending regulatory disclosure. She read it twice. Indefinitely. A single word capable of turning champagne into cold coffee. Across the hall, Boardroom A's doors swung open. Executives emerged one by one, their faces gray and stunned. Martin Hale was last. He looked toward Ruby, and in his eyes for the first time she saw no confidence. Only the expression of a man realizing the floor beneath him had started to crack. Ruby closed her laptop slowly. The storm she had triggered was no longer confined to one office. It was heading somewhere far bigger, and Martin knew it. The question was whether he would surrender quietly or try one last move before the walls closed in. At 9:07 a.m., the office was still standing. That felt almost insulting. The carpet remained immaculate. The espresso machine hissed with cheerful indifference. Somewhere near reception, someone laughed too loudly, the way people do when they sense disaster and instinctively try to prove to the universe that everything is normal. But on the 32nd floor of Arion Systems, normal had already packed its things and left through the service elevator. Ruby sat at her desk, her notebook open, her coffee untouched and cold enough to qualify as a historical artifact. Across the corridor, Boardroom A looked like an aquarium filled with anxious executives. Through the glass, Martin Hale moved from one end of the room to the other, phone pressed to his ear, gestures clipped and sharp. He looked like a conductor whose orchestra had stopped believing in the score. Her inbox chimed, then chimed again, and again. 3 new messages arrived in under a minute. The first was from Internal Legal. Please preserve all notes, logs, and communications related to Project Atlas. The second came from IT Operations. Your account has been temporarily restored pending investigation. Ruby blinked. 27 minutes ago, she had been ceremoniously escorted toward irrelevance. Now the company was giving her back the keys. The third email came from Martin Hale himself. No greeting, no courtesy, just 5 words. Meet me in my office. Now. Ruby read the message twice. Then she closed it and remained exactly where she was. That was the small luxury of being fired. Urgency had become someone else's problem. A minute later, her desk phone rang. She answered. Ruby. Martin's voice was smooth again, but too smooth. The way ice looks perfectly calm while cracking underneath. I need to speak with you. You know where I am. A pause. I'd prefer this conversation be private. Ruby looked through the glass wall of his office. The skyline behind him was a blurred silver curtain, and his silhouette stood rigid at the window. Then you should have chosen privacy at 8:12. She hung up. For the first time in years, she experienced the rare and exquisite pleasure of not being intimidated. It felt like taking off high heels after a very long evening. At 9:18, Helen from HR appeared at Ruby's desk. Her expression carried that same careful neutrality HR professionals practiced like a martial art. Ruby, Martin would appreciate a few minutes. Ruby smiled politely. I appreciate many things. Helen blinked. It was such a small sentence, but It landed with the precision of a paper cut. Legal has advised that you remain cooperative. I am cooperative. I've preserved my documentation and spoken with the bank. Helen's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. That one sentence told her everything she needed to know. Understood. She walked away, heels clicking against the floor with slightly less confidence than before. Ruby returned to her notebook. On the last page, she wrote a single question. Why use the account last night? She circled it twice, because that was the piece that didn't fit. The hidden account explained the secret. Martin's late-night login explained urgency, but not motive. What had he needed to do just hours before the merger? Her answer arrived unexpectedly. At 9:26, a message popped up from Noah Patel, a senior database analyst. Noah was brilliant, shy, and permanently undercaffeinated. He spoke in SQL more fluently than English. His message contained only one sentence. I think you should see this. Attached was a screenshot. Ruby opened it. Her pulse quickened. The image showed a transaction log from the finance system. Timestamp, 11:48 p.m. User, Orion Legacy Admin. Action, modified beneficial ownership schedule. Ruby read the line 3 times. Beneficial ownership, not payroll, not permissions. Ownership, the legal DNA of the merger itself. Another line was highlighted. Inserted entity, Voss Strategic Holdings. Added. Ruby sat very still. The room around her seemed to recede, as though someone had pulled all the oxygen toward the center of the page. That was the name. Not Elias Voss as a person. Voss as a holding company. A silent shareholder. A hidden beneficiary. A name that had never appeared in any board deck, cap table, or investor disclosure. The invisible passenger in a very expensive vehicle. Noah sent another message. This entity receives 4.5% of proceeds at closing. Ruby whispered the number under her breath. 4.5% of $300 million. $13.5 million. The amount was large enough to change a life. Or ruin several. Suddenly, Daniel's words made perfect sense. Elias Voss was a condition. Because whoever had rescued Orion years ago had negotiated a standing right to collect from its future success. A ghost clause, a financial boomerang, thrown in a crisis, returning years later with terrifying accuracy. And Martin Hale had updated the ownership schedule the night before closing. Not to create the arrangement, to activate it. Ruby leaned back slowly. The irony was almost elegant. The CEO who had called her role no longer needed had, less than 9 hours earlier, used a secret account to route millions to an undisclosed entity. And he had assumed no one would notice. People in power often confuse secrecy with invisibility. They are not the same. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Again, Ruby answered. Ms. Chen, this is Hannah Roth. Hannah's voice was brisk, but there was an unmistakable edge of disbelief. We've identified a previously undisclosed beneficiary entitled to a percentage of merger proceeds. Ruby glanced at Noah's screenshot. Yes. Can you verify whether the entry was added last night? I can. A short pause. Then Hannah said the sentence Ruby hadn't realized she needed to hear. Your documentation may have prevented our clients from wiring funds to an entity we were never told existed. Ruby closed her eyes for a moment. The vindication was quiet, almost weightless. No applause, no dramatic music. Just the subtle but profound satisfaction of knowing that facts, when properly documented, could still matter. Hannah continued. Regulators and outside counsel are being notified. Ruby exhaled slowly. And my employment status? For the first time, Hannah's voice softened. That is now the least interesting issue in the building. When the call ended, Ruby looked up. Across the office, Martin Hale emerged from the boardroom. He held himself upright, but only barely, like a building still standing after the foundation had shifted. He saw Ruby, saw her holding the printed screenshot Noah had just delivered to her desk. For one suspended second, neither moved. Then Martin's expression changed. Not anger, not arrogance. Recognition. The precise moment a man understands that the story he intended to control now belongs to someone else. Ruby placed the screenshot neatly into her notebook. Outside, the rain began to ease, and pale sunlight pressed through the clouds like a promise. The storm was not over, but the sky had started to change. And Martin had just realized that the most dangerous thing in the office was not the hidden account. It was the woman he had dismissed as unnecessary. The next time Martin entered a room, he would not be giving instructions. He would be answering questions. At 9:41 a.m., the building stopped pretending. Not in a dramatic collapse, not in alarms or flashing lights, but in something far more unsettling. Silence where certainty used to be. The kind of silence that spreads when everyone realizes the floor plan they trusted might have been drawn by someone with a second agenda. Ruby stood by her desk as the office around her fractured into invisible factions. Legal clustered near the glass wall of boardroom A. Finance stopped speaking in full sentences. HR had disappeared entirely into closed-door meetings that looked less like coordination and more like damage containment. And Martin was no longer pacing. He was calculating. Through the glass, Ruby watched him sit at the head of the table, hands folded, posture restored to something resembling control. But the difference now was subtle and irreversible. Control no longer looked like confidence. It looked like defense. Her screen lit up again. A new email from external counsel. Subject, preservation notice, litigation. Hold. Ruby read it once, then again. Litigation hold. A phrase that turned corporate optimism into evidence. Her phone buzzed immediately after. Daniel Mercer. She hesitated before answering. Ruby, he said quickly. Are you at your desk? Yes. A pause. You need to understand something before Martin frames this. Ruby glanced toward the boardroom. I'm listening. Daniel's voice dropped lower. The activation wasn't unauthorized in the way you think? Ruby's eyes narrowed slightly. Explain. Another pause. Heavier this time. The account wasn't just a beneficiary channel. It was a failsafe. Ruby didn't speak. She let the silence do its work. Daniel continued. When the company was saved years ago, the funds came with one structural condition. If Orion ever attempted to dilute or restructure ownership without triggering disclosure, the system would auto-validate the original agreement. Ruby's fingers tightened around her pen. So last night. Martin didn't just access the account, Daniel said. He triggered the validation sequence. A slow realization settled in her chest. Which means the merger automatically exposes the beneficiary structure at closing, Daniel finished. Ruby looked down at her notebook. Everything suddenly aligned. Not chaos, design. A delayed mechanism disguised as a hidden flaw. A financial trap built into the company's survival itself. She whispered, So Elias Voss was never a person. Daniel's silence confirmed it. He was a contractual enforcement identity. Yes, a system that didn't belong to HR or IT or even the board. Something older, more deliberate. Ruby felt the air in the room change. Outside, thunder rolled once more, but now it sounded distant, like something retreating rather than approaching. Who built it? She asked. Daniel's voice softened. I think you already know the answer you're afraid to say out loud. Ruby closed her eyes. Martin. Or someone who made sure Martin would inherit it? The CEO's office door opened. Martin stepped out. This time he wasn't walking toward control. He was walking toward inevitability. He stopped in front of Ruby's desk. For a moment, neither spoke. The office noise faded around them, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Martin finally said, You've seen the logs. It wasn't a question. Yes? His jaw tightened slightly. You don't understand what you're looking at. Ruby tilted her head. I understand that someone built a financial structure that survives leadership changes, restructurings, and mergers. A flicker in his eyes. And I understand that you tried to activate it last night. Martin exhaled slowly. That system was never meant to be triggered during a live transaction. And yet here we are. He looked at her then, really looked at her. Not as an employee, not as a problem, but as the only variable he hadn't accounted for. You think this gives you leverage, Kaha, he said quietly. Ruby's expression didn't change. I think it gives reality leverage. That sentence landed harder than anything else that morning because it reframed everything. This wasn't sabotage. It wasn't exposure. It was enforcement. Across the room, the CFO and legal counsel were now arguing in tight, urgent tones. Someone mentioned regulators. Someone else mentioned immediate suspension of closing mechanics. Martin didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on Ruby. You should have come to me first, he said. I did, she replied. A pause. You fired me instead. Something passed across his face, too quick to name. Regret? Calculation? Both? Then his phone vibrated. He looked at it. And for the first time since this began, Martin Hale's expression broke completely. Ruby saw it. Not anger, not fear. But the precise moment a man realizes he is no longer the author of the outcome. The message on his screen had one line. Regulatory authority has been notified of undisclosed beneficiary structure. Martin lowered the phone slowly. The room behind him erupted into motion. Voices, chairs, rapid footsteps. Containment had failed. Ruby remained still, because for her, nothing was collapsing. Something was resolving. Martin spoke quietly. This doesn't end cleanly. Ruby met his gaze. It already ended the moment you assumed I wouldn't look. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he nodded once. Not agreement, acknowledgement, and walked back into the boardroom. Not as a CEO defending a deal, but as a man entering a room where the outcome had already been written elsewhere. Ruby sat down. Outside, the rain finally stopped. Light broke through the clouds and spilled across the city in uneven gold lines, reflecting off glass towers like the first sign of morning after a very long night. Her phone buzzed one last time. Unknown number. She answered. A calm voice spoke. Ms. Chen, this is regulatory oversight. We need your formal statement. Ruby looked at her notebook, at the circled question, at the name that never existed in any official record. Then she said very simply, I have everything documented. And for the first time since 8:12 a.m., the building did not feel like it was hiding anything anymore. It felt like it was being read.